Welcome to another episode of Tree Talk. I'm with Dwayne Rigsby. Dwayne Rigsby is co-hosting with Jamie Dahl and Dave Apsley, in which they bring about a lot of information about forests and woodlands and trees. And we're going to take this opportunity in talking with Dwayne in presenting some videos that Jamie Dahl and Dwayne and Dave made specifically about oak trees. I think it's very important. Be quite frank with you, Tree Talk, I've learned a great deal about forests and woodlands, and especially the need for oak trees. So, Dwayne, really appreciate your co-hosting with this program.
Thank you, Patrick. The video that you're about to see is a good video on why oaks are important and the need to keep oaks. So if no further ado, I guess let's try to watch the video.
Hello, I'm Dave Apsley with OSU Extension.
And I'm Jamie Dahl with Central State University Extension.
And we're going to talk a little bit about oaks and why we're concerned. So if we can show the first slide.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about this kind of publication that Dave and I have been working on together with a broad range of partners really behind this effort, but really acknowledging that we do have an issue with oak, particularly in Southeast Ohio, and so we're pulling together this this little fact sheet to kind of raise more awareness just about this broad issue. And any other things you want to say about that fact sheet, Dave?
Just that it's a publication that was originally designed to mail to landowners to try to get them to actively manage for their oaks, but we're going to have a bunch of variety of different versions of that for different purposes, so stay tuned. We'll have a lot of pubs coming out.
Yeah, so but really that fact sheet is very simple. It doesn't really tell you all the pieces of the problem, but what we were trying right now is to just raise awareness about the problem, because a lot of folks just aren't aware. So one thing that is important to focus on is our slide here, this visual that basically shows us where are our forests in Ohio. And so depending on where you live, you may not kind of have a good idea of this big picture, but they really are predominantly in the southeast portion and kind of the eastern half of the state. And so those of us in the southeast, when we go into the woods, you may start to notice this kind of shift where we have these oak dominant canopies, but if you look at what's going on underneath on the forest floor, we have a lot of maple. So some other just big picture things about Ohio's forests. 66% of our forest is in those counties in the southeast, and about 60% of Ohio's forest is dominated by oak hickory.
So this southeast part of the state is the part that wasn't glaciated. It's too hilly to really be farmed, and that's where most of our forest is.
And so this is an infographic that Dave and I worked on together with some other colleagues at Ohio State. And basically, if you take a look at this kind of, you can see what's going on in the canopy. And so it's that we have that oak dominance. But then we start to see with these larger trees, when we look at the other parts of the canopy, a real shift. And if you want to click through, Dave.
So if you look at that top line, it shows the relationship between oak and maple. There are other trees in the canopy, but oaks and maple are the most dominant there. And then as we go to smaller diameters and smaller sizes of trees.
Yeah, and I guess an important thing, little background on this graphic, this is just showing the relationship between oak and maple in the 17 county area that we work in Ohio. So this is not including all other species, but you can see that, okay, in the larger trees, oak is dominant, and that's kind of what we classically think of in Ohio's forests. But then if we look at what's underneath in the mid-story, we start to see a little bit of a shift where there's more maple than oak. And so obviously as those trees grow up, we're shifting the dominance of what type of forest we're going to have. And then the problem continues.
And it gets more dramatic when you look at the understory and the smallest size trees. If you can look in the canopy, if you're just looking at oak and maple, about 70% of those trees are oak. get into the middle, it's closer to 30, 35%. And then when we look at the really young trees that are coming in, only about 20% are oak. So we're seeing these trends. We're using a lot of oak, but we're seeing, gosh, there aren't many oaks basically on the bench to come in and fill in when oaks die or when they're harvested or when we have a disturbance.
Right. So we're hoping this graphic, we're going to be using this more and more to kind of help people visualize what is going on. And I think sometimes people, we don't want this to come across as we're anti-maple. It's just maple is out competing a species that has a lot of ecological importance, and the oaks are going to need a little bit of help from us, and we can't just make that work on public land. We really have to work with our private landowners and raise awareness about how we can help these oaks to better regenerate, help the new oaks to come up in the forest.
I find that really interesting how the maples are starting to cover some of our forests.
Yeah, it's the maples tend to grow in the understory of the larger oaks, and that's where we're seeing more maples come about. Although it's a good thing, it's also could be a bad thing that it's covering the canopy and not letting some of the other oaks grow as well. So
that's
all good. All good.
Well, why are oak trees so important in our area?
Well, that's a good question. They're for a lot of different purposes. Not only the wood industry, but also for furniture making and things like that, and barrels and all kinds of things like that. What we have is another video for you on why are oak trees important with Dave and Jamie, and we're going to watch that video right now.
So for this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about why oak is important.
Yeah, so continuing on this kind of oak story, and what's up with this species that we're starting to hear is in jeopardy, and okay, why does it matter so much here in Ohio? And so one thing that I think really hits home, but a lot of people maybe not be aware of, is how important oak is to Ohio's economy. Now, I'll take a step back and just acknowledge how important the forest industry is to Ohio's economy. So it is actually a $26 billion chunk of the economic activity in Ohio. And I think a lot of times folks think about ag and they don't think about how forestry contributes to that. But I don't know, Dave.
Yeah, so this number, $26 billion, is something that Saeed Mahmood, one of our faculty members at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at OSU, pulled together. And what we found is $26 billion is quite a bit. Agriculture, as comparison in Ohio, is about $115 billion industry. But what's interesting is agriculture includes forestry. So of 115 billion, 26 billion of that is forestry. So we're getting around 20% of that total ag economy is in the forest products industry. So it's really important, not to mention recreation and other aspects of the economy that the forests contribute to.
And so our image here is actually of some of the bourbon barrels from Speyside, which is right near you, right, Dave?
It's in Jackson, Ohio. It's a fairly new factory producing cooperage bourbon barrels. They produce about 1,300 barrels a day and employ about 150 people. So it's really important for our local economy to have these forest products industries.
But of course, as forestry professionals, we want to support this industry, but we also need to think about how do we manage the resource sustainably so that we can continue to support the industry. And so one thing that Dave and I really work on is the role that private landowners play in that, because we can't just rely on public land to support that. And that really, barrels specifically do put the pressure on white oak, because that's the specific species that's used for barrel production.
And we're seeing some trends with white oak where, we're not regenerating it fast enough. So we need to work hard on managing it so that we can sustain it for the long haul.
All right. So some of the other reasons, another big one is the reliance of wildlife on on oak forests, and kind of the unique way that oaks, they really remain in the landscape. So they're kind of the legacy tree there for hundreds of years at times, and that's an important ecological role. So
yeah, we've got a couple slides here to illustrate that a little bit.
yeah, so so here's some kind of wildlife habitat images. I'm going to click it one more time, David. Yeah.
There.
So and of course there are so many animals. So you saw 90 different wildlife species that are connected to reliance on oak. But we have an image here of a vernal pond, a timber rattlesnake, a white-tailed deer. These are some species that really, in different ways, rely on that oak being a component of the ecosystem. And
the big piece with that is the acorns, and they're so important for so many species of wildlife. But there's also a lot of side benefits that we didn't realize until some of the more current research.
Right. So side benefits being just the composition of the leaf litter, and yeah, the vernal pool work is really interesting in that even vernal pools with an oak component versus a maple component, that we have amphibians thriving more in those oak-dominated pools. Also, something to think about is how this wildlife, recreation, wildlife viewing, hunting and fishing, those are contributing to the economy as well, and that's not captured in that 26 billion number that we talk about.
That is true. And then the other piece is just oaks are such a neat and important part of the ecosystem. They're extremely long-lived. White oak can live 600 years, so they're important, but they provide that stability to our forests. So we're all in on trying to keep oak around and making it a sustainable part of our forest. And so a lot of the efforts that you're going to see Jamie and I work on, and probably in the rest of my career and probably most of Jamie's career, is going to be focusing on oaks and private woodland owners, and even on public land, on how we can sustain it.
Something that I found rather interesting, Dwayne, is that acorns are so important to 90 different species in the forest.
Right. With all of the wildlife out there today, there's lots of things that it can be used for, feeding the animals and such. But without acorns, there's those animals and things can not survive on those, and they're going to be out maybe digging in some trash cans and things. So we want to make sure we try to keep those alive. And always contacting a forester is a good thing to try to reduce your canopy so the oak trees can grow. In our next video on why are oak trees in jeopardy, they're going to be talking about the understory and all the acorns establishing large roots. So let's watch our next video.
There's an analogy I think I've heard you use a couple times where you compare oak to Goldilocks.
Yeah, so what's Goldilocks have to do with oak? Well, oak are pretty particular. It's like the three bears. And depending on the situation, if we do nothing in our woods and no trees are harvested, or we only take a few trees out of the canopy, trees that like deep shade do really well, and that's the maples. So the maples can grow and survive in like 2% full sunlight, especially sugar. So they get started under the canopy of these oaks and they just hang out. And if we don't do anything, the maples start creeping up and become layers and layers under the forest. And so if it's too shady, the oaks lose to the maples. If we have a clear cut or a tornado came through or something happened where there's lots of light, then oaks can grow in those conditions, but other species do better. Things like tulip tree or yellow poplar or cherry or aspen, they'll grow very well in the full sun. So in order to get oaks started, we really need that middle ground. We need that just right condition where we've got some partial light, and that's where the oaks excel. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go from there.
Okay. And so part of the reason that sometimes in that fully open, maybe clear cut or fully disturbed setting, which oaks can be okay with, but basically the problem is these other species grow faster than them. And doesn't that have something to do, Dave, with kind of how oaks focus their energy? And I think you have a picture to maybe share that.
We've got a picture of Todd Hutchison, who's a researcher with the Delaware lab of the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service. He's holding up an oak seedling. We've had our graphic guy Brad do a little work on that seedling so you can can see it better. But what oaks do is when they're young seedlings, the acorn germinates, they put a lot of energy into the roots. And if they get that partial light, they're putting energy into the roots. And that root just gets larger and larger and larger. And it only really happens if the light's just right. If it's a maple, they put very little energy into the roots, they're putting energy into the tops. So what we want to do is get that right light so the oaks can get there and start developing that big taproot. Looks like a big carrot. And then once that happens, things in nature, disturbance happens. So one of the more common disturbances was fire. And if you have fire happening occasionally, a maple doesn't have a big root system, the fire's going to eventually kill it. With one burn or a few burns, a young maple seedling doesn't survive. With the oak, it's got that root system. It's got all that energy in the underground portion. Fire kills the top, and the top can start, or the root can start to grow, and that gives them a big competitive advantage. So things like fire, even livestock grazing at the right levels might have helped it. And right now we have a lot less fire. We don't have the livestock in the woods, and so the oaks are starting to lose. The other thing that's happened is the timber harvesting practices. We've gone away from harvesting a little bit heavier where we just take individual trees out of the canopy. And a lot of times those trees are, guess what? They're oaks.
The oaks.
So we've almost got a bounty on the oaks. We're taking them out of the canopy, but we're not creating conditions for young oaks to come in behind them.
Yeah, and that was in the words of a landowner, actually, right,
Yeah.
Dave, that said oaks have a bounty on them. So so interesting. So this kind of so pointing out to folks, like, understanding the history of any forest, because a lot of these disturbances that maybe some people think of as negative were actually a benefit to this particular species.
Right, and disturbance happens in nature. We have a lot of oak on the landscape for really two reasons. One, it's a perfect place to grow oak, but two, a lot of these forests came out of that heavy disturbance period when a lot of this ground was cleared for agriculture. There were cattle all over the place. And as hard as that is on forest conditions, oaks of all the species probably did the best. So we have historically probably high levels of oak currently now. And we realize there's probably going to be a bit of a shift, but we want to keep oak as a major component as well.
Okay, and so likely disturbance will be part of that then, if we're going to do that.
Very well could.
Yeah.
It's a great video on why oaks are in jeopardy. And remember about clear cutting. You can, if you clear cut, you'll have a greater chance of growing these other species besides oak, because oak is a much slower growing tree. You'll get a lot of those maples and other varieties outgrow your oaks, and then you will not have oaks.
Well, that is interesting. If we don't do anything, eventually the forest could become maple. So what do you think about some ways to encourage young oaks in woodlands?
Again, you should always try to contact a forester and let them come out and give you advice on where and what to cut. You should always try to do selective cutting if you can, to open that canopy to give those oaks greater sunlight to grow, and then always trying to trim back those smaller maples and other varieties in your understory.
Well, here we have sort of a neat video that follows what you're saying. So let's take a look.
And what we see is, of course, there's all these factors that contribute to what we're seeing on the forest floor. So if you are seeing some oak, wonderful, but how old are those oak, and are they able to continue to succeed, or is the canopy so closed in and they have so much other competition that they're not gonna be able to do that? Or if you don't have oak, is there a possibility that you're gonna get oak, but if you don't have a good overstory component, or you don't have good opportunity for acorns, then it's going to be hard to establish that. And then looking at what other components are there. Is there maple there? Are there invasives there? It's complicated.
It does get complicated, and that's where you're really getting a trained professional forester to help you. But if folks are going to do a harvest, they really need to, we've talked in the past about what normally happens. Normally a landowner just has someone cut the trees that they can make money on, but really it's more like a prescription when you talk about an illness or whatever. So if we go back back to the slides, we'll talk a little about some oak regeneration harvest. And the classic harvest that happens in Ohio, a single tree taking out a few trees out of the canopy, especially if those trees are the oaks that are producing the acorns, you can see it's not good for the oaks. We're still too shady. The maples and other species like maple and black gum are going to take over.
And that isn't another term that a logger sometimes throws out, or we hear the term selection, which may be kind of
or just
used
a select
in some,
cut.
Yeah, used it. That's a tricky term that could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah. We always kind of joke is, a lot of people say we're only going to select cut, and they say, well, is that good or bad? And I said, well, it depends on who's doing the selecting and why.
Yeah, and I think a good way, I've heard some foresters describe it as, I really like this, is to think about, instead of thinking about what it is that we're cutting and taking, you should be thinking about what is it that we are intentionally leaving.
What we're leaving, and then what's on that understory floor again. And then on the other extreme, if you go back to the slide, clear cuts favor other species. So if the oak's not there and we clear cut, we don't have young oaks there that are competitive, that have the big large taproot, so that when the light hits the forest floor, the oaks aren't going to win either. So then it's going to be yellow poplar or aspen or cherry, things like that. So we could convert it the other way too.
And I think we should give the caveat, right, Dave, that a lot of this is, when Dave and I are saying this, a lot of this is typically, but we want you all to consult with a service forester, state service forester, to help you figure some of this out on your own property, because it depends. It doesn't mean that some of these things, you might have your own kind of adjustments to these kind of broad statements that we have, because it really depends what's going on specifically on your property.
Yeah, and every property is different. Even on a given property, there's variation. The ideal harvest typically that really can favor oak is what we call a shelter wood. And that's where we're taking a part of the canopy off, maybe half of it, but what we're leaving is the oaks. And those oaks are there to produce the acorns for the young oak seedlings to get started. And we're producing that middle light level. We talked about Goldilocks before, but that's that light level where the oaks can put a lot of energy into the roots. But we also got to think about that interfering vegetation, that other mid-story of shade that can develop. Historically, fire kept that mid-story down, and there's an image there of some prescribed fire that's going on. The bottom image of the green is all that lower layer there is oak, and it's because that site had been burned repeatedly. The light levels are a little bit higher, and it's been burned repeatedly, and those oak seedlings with those big roots can get really well established and be very competitive and do quite well.
And maybe this is a good time to mention, again, if you consult with a professional, they can help you figure out the options with herbicide. And we are trying to work on some more options for private landowners with fire. In particular, if you are at a property where you are near state or federal land, there may actually be some opportunities for you to do a prescribed burn. So that's something to ask your local professionals about.
Patrick, again, that was a great video on the encouragement of young oaks in our woodlands. Remember, we can't say enough to always try to contact a forester if you can to get that select cutting, so they can help you mark out what you actually need to cut, and so you don't cut out the wrong things and grow a different species that you don't want. In our next video, oh, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
Well, no, you and I were talking about the same thing. There are a lot of key partners that are also very actively involved in this. Let's take a look.
So actually, if we check out this first slide, I think it's a great image of some of the key partners in this interagency forestry team. So this really is an effort. It's actually being acknowledged across the country as a great example of collaboration and kind of long-standing commitment between partners to work together on a common issue. And that issue is this effort effort to make sure that we are raising awareness about oak in Southeast Ohio and helping private landowners as well as public land ownership to work together to basically better promote regenerating and growing oak so that our future forests in Ohio still have a strong oak component.
And so the feature area, the focus area, this is a 17 county area in the extreme southeastern portion of the state. If you look at that map, you'll see different colors. Those represent public lands. So the main players in this really are the U.S. Forest Service. The dark green is the Wayne National Forest. We've also got state agencies, Division of Forestry and Division of Wildlife make up the bulk of the other colors. Those are wildlife areas and state forest, and that's where most of our state forest is. And then the other key partners are us, Cooperative Extension, Ohio State University, and Central State. So we're kind of the original partners at the table, but this partner list is growing. We've got folks like National Wild Turkey Federation, Nature Conservancy, and other folks working with us on this project. Another little point, this 17 county area makes up a small portion of, of 88 counties. That's about 20% of the land area in Ohio. But over 40% of our forest is right here in this smaller area in Ohio.
Yeah, and I think just to, again, highlight, though you see a lot of public agencies listed here, the private land ownership is really crucial to our efforts, and it's a focus of this interagency forestry team, is how do we do more work across boundaries. We use a term a lot called shared stewardship that we'll talk about more, but that really public land ownership is not that high in Ohio. So this we have to support private landowners in also overall forest health and specifically this oak issue, or we will not make the progress that we need to.
Yeah, and if you look at the map, it's pretty clear. There's a lot of color on the map, but there's still a lot of white on the map, and the white represents privately owned individuals, a lot of small farms that are mostly forested. What we're really trying to do is change the business model a little bit. We're trying to figure out ways to be efficient. We don't have a lot of people even though we've got all these agencies working together, we're still really kind of minimal in the number of folks we've got. So we're trying to figure out ways to work efficiently, share the resources we do have so that we can get more impact with the resources we've had.
And so as a team, we've actually selected a shared stewardship project area, and so it actually touches on 5 counties, primarily Athens, Hocking, and Benton, but also hitting Perry and Morgan. And so you can see that up on the screen. And basically, we are really focusing our energy in this area so that we can start to see how some of this plays out on the landscape, and hopefully have some success stories in the near future of how we're able to do these cross-boundary treatments and really demonstrate success with promoting oak on the landscape. And Dave and I's role has a lot to do with the messaging around these efforts and reaching private landowners.
Yeah, so just to orient yourself on that map a little bit, the very southern tip is the Benton Furnace State Forest, and the very northern and eastern tip is up around Burr Oak State Park. So that's where we're focusing. There's a lot of public land there. We're trying to pull in relationships between the neighboring landowners and trying to get good oak management on the ground in a very focused way so we can optimize the resources. You're going to see a lot of educational programmings coming up in the future from us and all the partners to try to encourage people to be proactive and to look at that forest as a resource and do the things they can do to make it a better resource for the long haul. And the term I like to use is legacy. We like to leave a positive legacy for the folks that are coming in the future.
Oaks are so important, not only to the farmland, the woodlands, the forestry, but it's also very important to all of us.
Yep, absolutely, Patrick. It's important for industry. It's important for wildlife, and it's just important for the overall, I think, health of the forest to have that variety.
Well, we've completed a number of Tree Talk programs, and I think if you go to the link that we have down below, you'll find that we can have a variety of different videos.